Marcus Davidson had always prided himself on being the first person awake in his Atlanta neighborhood, but that Tuesday morning in late September, something felt terribly wrong even before his alarm clock buzzed at 5:30. The silence outside his window was absolute, broken only by what sounded like distant sirens that had been wailing continuously throughout the night, weaving themselves into his restless dreams. He pulled back the curtain of his second-floor bedroom and peered into the pre-dawn darkness, noticing that several cars on Maple Street sat abandoned with their doors wide open, interior lights still glowing weakly in the gloom. Marcus rubbed his eyes and checked his phone, finding 17 missed calls from his sister Jennifer, 12 text messages from his coworker David, and a string of emergency alerts that made his stomach drop. The most recent alert, timestamped just 14 minutes ago, read in bold capital letters, "Shelter in place. Do not approach individuals displaying aggressive behavior or apparent illness. Await further instructions." His hands trembled as he scrolled through Jennifer's increasingly frantic messages, the first one sent at 11:47 the previous night asking if he was watching the news, the last one sent at 3:18 in the morning saying simply, "Marcus, if you see this, I'm taking the kids to the cabin. They're everywhere. Don't trust the authorities. Get out of the city." Marcus moved quickly to his living room and switched on the television, flipping through channels until he found a news broadcast, though the image was shaky and the female reporter looked absolutely terrified. She stood in front of what appeared to be Atlanta's Mercy General Hospital, her usually perfect hair disheveled, her voice cracking as she spoke into the microphone. "We're receiving reports from across the metropolitan area of individuals attacking others without provocation, and we need to emphasize that these are not isolated incidents," she said, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "Authorities are describing the attackers as exhibiting unusual strength and an apparent inability to respond to pain or verbal commands. The CDC has issued a statement saying they're investigating what they're calling an aggressive pathogen, but they're urging everyone to remain indoors and..." The reporter suddenly stopped mid-sentence, her eyes widening as screams erupted from somewhere off-camera. The camera jerked violently to the left, and Marcus felt his blood run cold as he saw a group of people stumbling toward the news crew with an unnatural, lurching gait. Their clothes were torn and stained dark with what could only be blood, their faces pale and slack, their eyes vacant yet somehow filled with terrible purpose. One of them, a man in a shredded business suit, opened his mouth impossibly wide and released a sound that was neither human nor animal, a wet, rattling growl that seemed to come from somewhere deep and broken inside him. The camera feed cut to black, replaced by a static emergency broadcast screen displaying the same shelter-in-place message. Marcus stood frozen in his living room, his mind racing through possibilities and rejecting each one as too impossible, too much like the horror movies he'd watched with his friends during countless weekend gatherings. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. But then he heard it, a slow, dragging sound coming from the street below, accompanied by that same inhuman growling he'd just heard on the television. He moved to the window again, staying carefully to the side, and looked down to see his neighbor, old Mrs. Patterson, who had lived 3 houses down for as long as he could remember, shuffling down the middle of the street in her nightgown. Her head hung at an odd angle, and even from the second floor, Marcus could see dark stains covering her clothes and what looked like deep wounds on her arms and neck. She moved past his house with that terrible lurching walk, dragging one foot behind her, and Marcus noticed with growing horror that she wasn't alone. Behind her, spread out across the street in ones and twos, came more figures, all moving with that same unnatural gait, all heading in the same direction as if drawn by some invisible signal. Marcus backed away from the window, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. He grabbed his phone with shaking hands and tried calling Jennifer, but the call wouldn't connect. He tried David, then his parents in Florida, then 911, but every attempt met with either dead air or a recorded message saying all circuits were busy. He was alone, trapped in his house while outside the world transformed into something from his darkest nightmares, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered the truth he didn't want to accept: this was only the beginning, and nothing would ever be the same again. Marcus spent the next 20 minutes moving through his house in a controlled panic, his military training from his 4 years in the National Guard finally kicking in and overriding the primal fear that threatened to paralyze him completely. He started in the kitchen, filling every container he could find with water from the tap while it still ran clear and strong, remembering the survival instructor who had drilled into his unit that clean water would be the first thing to go in any major disaster. He grabbed canned goods from his pantry, protein bars from the cabinet, anything non-perishable that he could stuff into his old military duffel bag along with a first aid kit, flashlights, batteries, and the camping gear he kept in the hall closet. His hands moved automatically, methodically, even as his mind struggled to process the impossible reality of what was happening outside his walls. The television continued its emergency broadcast in the background, now cycling through the same 3 messages over and over: shelter in place, avoid contact with infected individuals, do not attempt to reach hospitals or emergency facilities. That last instruction struck Marcus as particularly ominous because it suggested that the very places people would naturally flee to for safety had already been compromised, already fallen to whatever this plague was that turned ordinary people into those shambling, violent creatures. He was loading his grandfather's old hunting rifle, checking and rechecking that he had enough ammunition, when he heard the banging start on his front door. The sound was rhythmic, insistent, not the frantic pounding of someone seeking help but rather the mindless repetition of something that had no concept of fatigue or pain. Marcus crept to the front hallway, avoiding the direct line of sight from the door's small decorative window, and carefully peered around the corner. Through the frosted glass, he could make out a distorted figure repeatedly hitting the door with what looked like both fists, over and over, never stopping, never slowing. The door frame creaked ominously, and Marcus realized with a spike of fear that his front door wasn't particularly sturdy. He'd been meaning to replace it for months after noticing the wood had started to rot around the hinges. He backed away slowly, his rifle gripped tightly in his hands, and had just reached the kitchen when he heard glass shattering from somewhere upstairs. His blood turned to ice. The window. He'd left his bedroom window open the night before to let in the cool autumn air. Marcus took the stairs 2 at a time, his heart hammering against his ribs, and burst into his bedroom to find a man hauling himself through the open window with jerky, uncoordinated movements that nonetheless showed terrible determination. The man's face was a ruin of torn flesh and exposed bone, one eye missing completely, his jaw working up and down in a constant chewing motion even though there was nothing in his mouth. The thing that had once been a man turned its remaining eye toward Marcus and released that same bone-chilling growl he'd heard from the television, from the street below, and now here in his own bedroom. It pulled itself fully through the window and lunged forward with surprising speed, arms outstretched, fingers curled into claws. Marcus didn't think, didn't hesitate, didn't allow himself to consider that this creature might have been someone's father or brother or friend just hours ago. He raised the rifle and fired, the shot deafening in the enclosed space, and the creature dropped instantly as the bullet found its mark. The body lay still on his bedroom floor, dark fluid pooling beneath it, and Marcus stood there trembling, his ears ringing, the smell of gunpowder sharp in his nose. The sound of the gunshot seemed to echo through the entire neighborhood, and within seconds, Marcus heard more of those terrible growls rising up from the street outside, dozens of them, maybe more. The banging on his front door intensified, joined now by similar sounds at his back door, at the downstairs windows, as if the noise had drawn every infected person within hearing distance straight to his location. Marcus ran to his bedroom window and looked out to see a crowd gathering below, their faces tilted upward, their mouths open and gaping, their hands reaching up toward him like a congregation of the damned. There had to be at least 30 of them, and more were shambling into view from neighboring streets. His house, his sanctuary, had just become a trap, and Marcus knew with absolute certainty that he had perhaps minutes, maybe an hour at most, before those things found a way inside. He needed to leave, needed to run, but the sight of that growing mob below told him that stepping outside would mean immediate death, and so he stood frozen between 2 impossible choices, neither of which offered any guarantee of survival. 2. Marcus was still staring down at the growing horde when he heard a voice calling his name from somewhere close by, urgent but controlled, cutting through the cacophony of growls and banging that had become the soundtrack to this nightmare. He spun around, rifle raised, and spotted movement at the window of the house directly across the street, the two-story colonial that belonged to Tyler Bennett and his wife Rachel. Tyler was leaning out of his attic window, waving frantically to get Marcus's attention, his other hand cupped around his mouth as he shouted again. "Marcus! The roofs! You need to get to your roof." At first, the suggestion seemed absurd, almost laughable, but then Marcus understood what Tyler was proposing. The houses on Maple Street were built close together, close enough that someone athletic and desperate enough might be able to jump from one roof to another, and Tyler's house sat on the corner where Maple intersected with Oak Avenue, which led directly out toward the less densely populated suburbs. It was insane, potentially suicidal, but it was also the only option that didn't involve trying to fight through 30 or more infected people with limited ammunition and zero guarantee of making it to his car. Marcus gave Tyler a sharp nod and ran from his bedroom to the hallway, yanking down the folding ladder that led to his attic while the sounds of breaking glass erupted from somewhere on the first floor. They were inside now, or would be within seconds, and he could hear their dragging footsteps and wet breathing as they stumbled through his home. He threw his duffel bag up into the attic opening, then hauled himself up with strength born of pure adrenaline, pulling the ladder up behind him just as he heard the thundering of feet on his staircase, not the slow shuffle he'd come to associate with the infected, but actual running footsteps. Some of them could move fast. That realization sent a fresh wave of terror through him as he scrambled across the dusty attic floor to the small window at the far end, the one that opened onto his roof's steep slope. He kicked the window out completely rather than waste time opening it properly, grabbed his duffel bag, and crawled through onto the shingles just as something heavy slammed into the attic floor below him, accompanied by the sound of wood splintering. The morning sun had finally risen above the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed obscenely beautiful given the horror unfolding below, and from his elevated vantage point, Marcus could see that the situation was far worse than he'd imagined. Smoke rose from at least a dozen different locations throughout the city, some thin and gray, others thick and black, suggesting fires that had been burning unchecked for hours. Cars were piled up on the main highway visible in the distance, some overturned, some still burning, and between the houses and along every street he could see, there were bodies, some lying still, others moving with that characteristic lurching gait of the infected. Tyler appeared on his own roof across the street, Rachel right behind him, both of them carrying backpacks and what looked like a crowbar and a baseball bat respectively. "You're going to have to jump to the Henderson place first," Tyler shouted, pointing to the house between them, a single-story ranch that sat lower than both their homes. "Then you can make it to our roof. It's not as far as it looks." Marcus studied the gap between his roof and the Henderson house, estimating it at roughly 8 feet, maybe 9, across and about 6 feet down. Under normal circumstances, it would be a challenging but manageable jump. Under current circumstances, with a heavy duffel bag, shaking hands, and the knowledge that failure meant falling directly into a crowd of infected people, it seemed nearly impossible. But the sound of something moving in his attic, scratching and bumping against the walls, told him he was out of time for hesitation. He took several deep breaths, backed up to get a running start, and tried not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. Behind him, he heard the window frame crack as something tried to force its way through, and that was all the motivation he needed. Marcus ran forward, his boots slapping against the shingles, and launched himself into the air over the gap, over the infected people reaching upward from the ground below, over the abandoned cars and the scattered belongings of people who had fled or died in the night. For a moment, he was suspended in the air, weightless, caught between his old life and whatever came next, and then his feet hit the Henderson roof and he was rolling, scrambling for purchase, the shingles rough against his hands as he slid downward before finally catching himself on the gutter. Marcus lay flat against the Henderson roof for several precious seconds, his chest heaving, his fingers still gripping the aluminum gutter so tightly that his knuckles had turned white, and below him he could hear the infected converging on the spot where they'd seen him land, their bodies pressing against the side of the house with enough collective force that the whole structure seemed to shudder. Tyler's voice cut through his momentary paralysis, urgent and commanding, telling him to keep moving, to get up and make the second jump before more of those things figured out how to climb or break through the Henderson house to reach him. Marcus forced himself to his feet, retrieved his duffel bag which had slid several feet away, and this time didn't allow himself the luxury of overthinking the physics or the danger. He ran and jumped, and Tyler was there on the other side, his strong hands gripping Marcus's arm and helping to pull him up onto the colonial's steeper roof, Rachel standing guard behind them with her baseball bat raised and ready. "Thank God," Rachel breathed, and Marcus could see tears streaking through the dust on her face. "We thought we were the only ones left on the whole street. The Coopers next door, the Yamadas, the Richardsons, we saw them all change during the night, or get attacked, or just disappear." Tyler helped Marcus find his footing on the slope, then gestured for both of them to follow him to the opposite side of the roof, away from the growing crowd of infected that had gathered below. "We've been up here since about 2 in the morning, Tyler explained as they moved carefully across the shingles. "I heard screaming outside and looked out to see Mrs. Patterson attacking Jim Cooper in his driveway, actually biting him, and within maybe 20 minutes, Jim was up and moving around like he hadn't just died right there on the pavement." Rachel made a small, choked sound at the memory, and Tyler put his arm around her shoulders briefly before continuing. "We tried calling for help, tried everything, but it's like the whole system just collapsed all at once. No police, no ambulances, nothing. The last news report we saw before the broadcast went dead said this was happening in every major city on the East Coast simultaneously." Marcus felt his stomach drop at that information because he'd been holding onto some small hope that this was localized, containable, something that the government or military could surround and eliminate, but if Tyler was right, if this outbreak had struck everywhere at once, then there might be no safe zone to flee toward, no rescue coming over the horizon. They reached the back edge of the roof, and Marcus saw what Tyler had been leading them toward, a large oak tree whose branches stretched out over this side of the house, offering a natural bridge down to the ground level where a wooden privacy fence separated the backyard from the alley beyond. "There's only 3 of them in the backyard right now," Tyler said quietly, pointing down to where 3 infected individuals wandered aimlessly near the fence line, not yet aware of the living people above them. "We think if we can get down fast and quiet, get over that fence before they react, we've got a clear shot down the alley to where it meets Riverside Drive. From there, Rachel's brother has a cabin about 40 miles north, up in the mountains, away from the city." It was a plan, at least, which was more than Marcus had 5 minutes ago, but he could see the obvious flaw that Tyler and Rachel must have already considered. Getting down from the tree would make noise, the fence was at least 6 feet tall and would require climbing, and even if those 3 infected in the yard were slow, they only needed to make enough noise to attract the dozens more that were surely within hearing distance. Marcus was about to voice these concerns when a new sound reached them from several houses down, the unmistakable roar of an engine starting up, followed by shouting, human shouting, alive and terrified. All 3 of them turned to see a blue pickup truck come crashing through a garage door 4 houses away, wood and metal flying in all directions, and Marcus recognized the driver as Kevin Walsh, a construction worker who lived alone and kept to himself. The truck's bed was loaded with supplies, and Kevin was clearly making a desperate bid for escape, but the noise had attracted every infected person in a 3-block radius. They converged on the truck from all directions, throwing themselves at it with no regard for their own safety, and Marcus watched in horror as several of them managed to grab onto the sides and began pulling themselves up even as Kevin accelerated wildly down the street, sideswiping cars and mailboxes in his panic, and then the truck swerved too hard, overcorrected, and flipped completely over in an explosion of shattering glass and screaming metal that echoed through the entire neighborhood. Like a dinner bell calling the dead to feast. The sound of Kevin's truck crash reverberated through the morning air like thunder, and for a single frozen moment, everything seemed to stop. The infected paused in their wandering, Marcus and his companions held their breath on the rooftop, and even the distant sirens seemed to fade into silence. Then chaos erupted as every infected person within sight turned toward the overturned truck and began moving in that direction, some with the slow shuffle Marcus had first observed, others with that terrifying speed that suggested the infection affected people differently depending on factors he couldn't begin to understand. From their vantage point on the roof, Marcus could see Kevin struggling inside the cab, his arm reaching through the shattered driver's side window, and the man's voice carried clearly across the distance as he screamed for help, screamed for someone to please God help him. Rachel grabbed Marcus's arm, her fingernails digging into his skin through his shirt. "We have to do something," she said, her voice breaking. "We can't just let them, we have to help him." But Tyler's face had gone hard and calculating, and Marcus recognized the expression of someone making impossible decisions in impossible circumstances. "There's at least 50 of those things heading toward him right now," Tyler said flatly. "We go down there, we die with him. But while they're all distracted, while they're all focused on that truck, we have maybe 2 minutes to get down this tree, over that fence, and into the alley before they notice us." Marcus looked from Tyler to Rachel to the distant truck where Kevin's screams were becoming more desperate, more terrified, and he felt something fundamental break inside himself as he realized that Tyler was right, that the cold mathematics of survival demanded they use this man's horrible death as cover for their own escape, and that hesitation or sentiment would only add 3 more bodies to the day's count. He'd made hard choices during his deployment overseas, had seen good people die because of bad timing and worse luck, but this felt different, more personal, a conscious decision to value his own life over someone else's rather than the random cruelty of a roadside bomb or enemy fire. Rachel was crying openly now, but she didn't argue further, and Marcus understood that she'd already come to the same terrible conclusion even as every decent impulse in her screamed against it. Tyler moved first, swinging himself down onto the oak tree's thick branch with practiced ease, then reaching up to help Rachel navigate the transition from roof to limb. Marcus followed, his duffel bag making the movement awkward, and he nearly lost his grip when Kevin's screams suddenly cut off mid-cry, replaced by sounds that Marcus knew would haunt whatever remained of his dreams for the rest of his life. They climbed down through the oak's branches as quickly as they dared, and Marcus tried to focus on placing his hands and feet correctly rather than on what was happening 4 houses away, tried to shut out the feeding sounds and the wet tearing and the moans of the infected as they crowded around their prize. The 3 infected in Tyler's backyard had moved toward the front of the house, drawn by the commotion, leaving their escape route temporarily clear. Tyler dropped to the ground first, landing in a crouch with his crowbar ready, then positioned himself to catch Rachel as she lowered herself from the lowest branch. Marcus came last, and the moment his feet hit the grass, all 3 of them were running for the fence. Tyler reached it first and laced his fingers together to give Rachel a boost up, and she scrambled over the top with an agility born of pure terror. Marcus threw his duffel bag over, then turned to help Tyler, but the older man was already climbing, using a trash can for leverage, and Marcus was just starting his own ascent when he heard the growl directly behind him, close enough that he could smell the death on its breath. He spun around to find one of the infected had rounded the corner of the house, a teenage boy whose high school leather jacket marked him as someone's son, someone's friend, someone who had a whole life ahead of him until yesterday. The creature lunged forward with its arms outstretched, and Marcus swung his rifle like a club, connecting with the side of its head with enough force to send it stumbling sideways. He didn't wait to see if it would get back up, didn't waste time with a killing shot that would bring every infected in the neighborhood down on their position. Instead, he jumped for the fence, his fingers catching the top edge, his boots scrabbling for purchase against the wooden slats as Tyler and Rachel grabbed his arms and hauled him over just as more infected came pouring around both corners of the house, drawn by the noise and the movement and that inexplicable sense that seemed to tell them where the living could be found. Marcus landed hard on the alley side of the fence, his ankle twisting slightly on the uneven pavement, and behind them the infected threw themselves against the wooden barrier with enough force that the entire structure shook and creaked ominously. Tyler was already moving, gesturing frantically for them to follow him down the narrow alley that ran behind the houses, lined on both sides with overflowing trash cans and abandoned bicycles and all the ordinary debris of suburban life that now seemed like relics from a vanished civilization. They ran in single file, Rachel in the middle, their footsteps echoing off the close walls, and Marcus kept glancing over his shoulder expecting to see the fence give way or to see infected pouring around the corners to cut off their escape. The alley stretched for what felt like miles but was probably only 2 blocks before it opened onto Riverside Drive, and what Marcus saw when they emerged made his already racing heart sink even further. The main road was completely clogged with abandoned vehicles, a chaotic tangle of cars and trucks and minivans that told the story of a panicked evacuation attempt gone horribly wrong. Doors hung open, windows were smashed, and there were dark stains on the pavement that Marcus tried not to examine too closely. More worrying were the infected wandering among the vehicles, at least 20 that he could see from their position, with probably more hidden from view. Tyler pulled them back into the alley's shadows, breathing hard, his face slick with sweat despite the cool morning air. "My truck is parked 3 blocks east," he whispered, "in the lot behind Ricardo's Sporting Goods. If we can reach it, if it's still there and still running, we've got a chance." Rachel nodded, her hand finding Tyler's and gripping it tightly, and Marcus saw the look that passed between them, the kind of wordless communication that only came from years of partnership, a mixture of love and fear and determination to survive this together or not at all. They moved along the alley parallel to Riverside Drive, using the buildings and fences for cover, trying to stay out of sight of the infected on the main road. Marcus's ankle throbbed with each step, not seriously injured but enough to remind him that any weakness, any injury, any small piece of bad luck could be the thing that killed you in this new world. They passed behind a Chinese restaurant where the back door stood open, and the smell that wafted out was already the smell of decay, of food rotting and something worse, something that suggested the staff hadn't made it out when everything went wrong. The sporting goods store came into view after what felt like an eternity of careful, quiet movement, a squat concrete building with bars on the windows and a heavy metal security door that hung partially open, swaying slightly in the breeze. Tyler's white pickup truck sat in the small parking lot behind it, seemingly untouched, and Marcus felt a surge of hope that was immediately crushed when they got closer and saw that all 4 tires had been slashed, deep cuts that left the vehicle sitting on its rims, completely useless. "No, no, no," Tyler muttered, moving toward the truck as if he could somehow will the damage away, and Rachel put her hand on his shoulder, her face pale but composed. "We need another option," she said quietly. "What about inside the store? There might be supplies, maybe a phone that works, maybe." She was cut off by a voice from inside the building, a male voice, young and hostile. "I can hear you out there. I've got a gun, and I will use it if you try to come in here. This is my store, my supplies, so just move along." Marcus exchanged glances with Tyler, then stepped closer to the open door, keeping his hands visible and his rifle pointed down. "We're not infected," he called out. "We're just trying to survive like everyone else. We don't want trouble." There was a long pause, and then the voice came again, slightly less aggressive but still wary. "Prove it. Say something only a living person would know." Marcus almost laughed at the absurdity of the request because what could he possibly say that would satisfy that criteria, but then he understood what the person inside really wanted, just to hear normal human speech, normal human interaction, proof that the world hadn't completely ended. "The Braves lost their last 3 games before all this started," Marcus said. "Everyone was saying they'd choke in the playoffs like always, and my coworker David bet me $50 they wouldn't make it past the first round." Another pause, longer this time, and then the security door opened wider to reveal a young man, maybe 19 or 20, with shaggy brown hair and a shotgun that shook noticeably in his hands. "I'm Derek," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "This is my dad's store. He went out last night to check on my mom at the hospital, and he never came back. I've been here alone since midnight, and I keep hearing them outside, and I don't know what to do." Marcus lowered his rifle completely and took a careful step toward Derek, recognizing the specific kind of terror in the young man's eyes, the terror of someone who had been forced to grow up in a single night, who had lost everything familiar and was now clinging to the last solid thing in his world, even if that thing was just a concrete building full of camping equipment and baseball bats. "Derek, I'm Marcus. This is Tyler and Rachel. We're heading north to get away from the city, away from the density of infected. You're welcome to come with us, but first we need to find another vehicle because Tyler's truck is destroyed." Derek's grip on the shotgun relaxed slightly, and he stepped back to allow them entry into the store, which Marcus immediately saw was a survivalist's dream: aisles of camping gear, freeze-dried food, water filtration systems, cold weather clothing, and an entire wall dedicated to hunting and fishing equipment. The store's emergency lights were still running on backup power, casting everything in a dim fluorescent glow that flickered occasionally, and Derek had clearly been busy fortifying the place, stacking boxes and equipment against the windows and the front entrance. "There's a delivery van in the garage bay," Derek said, gesturing toward the back of the store. "My dad used it for large deliveries. It's got half a tank of gas, maybe enough to get you 40 or 50 miles if you drive careful." Tyler immediately moved in that direction while Rachel began gathering supplies, moving through the aisles with efficient purpose, grabbing water bottles, energy bars, first aid supplies, and cold weather gear. Marcus stayed with Derek, who seemed reluctant to move from his position near the door, his eyes constantly darting toward the street beyond where shadows moved with that now familiar shambling gait. "You should pack your things," Marcus said gently. "Get whatever you need for a long trip. We're not coming back here." But Derek shook his head, his jaw set in a stubborn line that reminded Marcus painfully of soldiers he'd known who had chosen to make their last stand rather than retreat. "I can't leave. What if my dad comes back? What if he made it out of the hospital and he's trying to get home, and I'm not here?" Marcus wanted to tell him the truth, wanted to explain that if Derek's father had gone to a hospital last night, he was almost certainly dead or worse, but he also understood that hope, even unrealistic hope, was sometimes the only thing keeping a person functional in circumstances like these. The decision was taken out of their hands when the sound of breaking glass erupted from the front of the store, followed by the wet growling that Marcus had come to associate with imminent death. One of the infected had managed to break through Derek's fortifications, pushing aside a stack of boxes and squeezing through a gap in the barred window, and behind it came others, drawn by whatever instinct or sense drove them toward the living. Derek raised his shotgun but froze, his finger on the trigger but unable to pull it, and Marcus saw why. The first infected through the window wore a security guard uniform with a name tag that read Ricardo Sporting Goods, and the family resemblance between the infected man and Derek was unmistakable. "Dad," Derek whispered, and that single word contained all the grief and horror and impossible hope of someone confronting the absolute worst outcome imaginable. The creature that had been Derek's father lunged forward, its mouth open and reaching, and Marcus didn't hesitate this time, couldn't afford to hesitate. He fired once, and Derek's father dropped, and the young man made a sound like something breaking inside him. "We need to move now." Tyler's voice came from the back of the store, and Marcus grabbed Derek's arm, physically pulling him away from the scene, away from the body of his father and the other infected now climbing through the widened gap. Rachel had already loaded supplies into the van, and Tyler had the engine running, the garage bay door grinding slowly upward to reveal the alley beyond where more infected were beginning to gather, drawn by the noise. They piled into the van with Derek stumbling numbly into the back seat, and Tyler accelerated hard, clipping two infected with the van's bumper and sending them spinning away. Marcus looked back through the rear window as Ricardo's Sporting Goods receded into the distance, seeing more infected pouring into the building, and he thought about all the things they were leaving behind, their homes, their old lives, the people they'd known, the world they'd understood. Derek was crying silently in the back seat. Rachel held Tyler's hand as he drove, and ahead of them lay only uncertainty, a landscape transformed into enemy territory, and the slim hope that somewhere north, somewhere less populated, they might find a place to catch their breath and figure out how to survive in a world that had fundamentally changed overnight. The first outbreak had marked the beginning of humanity's greatest test, and Marcus understood with absolute clarity that this wasn't a story about the end of the world, it was a story about what came after, about whether people could hold on to their humanity when everything human had been stripped away, and whether survival was enough of a reason to keep fighting when everyone you loved was gone and tomorrow promised only more of the same struggle, the same fear, the same desperate scramble to see another sunrise in a world that now belonged to the dead.